It's been decades since Hollywood legends James Garner and Randolph Scott last shared the silver screen. But new reflections from Garner's old interviews have reignited interest in the truth behind their working relationship. To the public, both men were icons of the Western era, rugged, charming, and effortlessly cool. But behind the camera, there were rumors of tension, respect, and even quiet admiration that few ever knew about. Now, long after both men have passed, film historians and fans alike are revisiting James Garner's candid words, a rare glimpse into what he really thought of Randolph. Scott, known for his straightforward personality and distaste for Hollywood pretension, Garner never shied away from speaking his mind. Randy was an old pro, Garner once said, and he carried himself like it. But he wasn't easy to figure out. That single comment has sparked decades of curiosity. What did Garner mean? Was there friction on set? Or was it simply the respectful distance between two men from very different eras of Hollywood? Randolph Scott represented the classic Western hero, stoic, disciplined, and steeped in the traditions of the studio system. James Garner, on the other hand, was part of a newer generation, natural, witty, and unafraid to question authority. When these two worlds collided, the results were as fascinating as they were unpredictable. In this story, we uncover what James Garner truly thought about Randolph Scott, from their early encounters to the lessons Garner took away from one of Hollywood's most mysterious and revered cowboys. The truth, as it turns out, is far more revealing than anyone expected. The year was 1956, and Hollywood was at the height of its love affair with the Western. Studios were churning out tales of dusty towns, brave sheriffs, and outlaw justice faster than audiences could watch them. Among the stars who defined the genre stood Randolph Scott, the epitome of the strong, silent cowboy. With his chiseled features, upright posture, and no-nonsense demeanor, Scott had become the symbol of old-school masculinity, the kind of man audiences believed could tame the frontier with nothing more than a stare. Enter James Garner, a fresh-faced actor just breaking into the business. Garner was a different breed, quick with a grin, effortless in charm, and unafraid to show humor or vulnerability in his roles. While Scott was the embodiment of traditional Hollywood heroism, Garner represented the new era, naturalistic, sarcastic, and human. Their worlds would collide on the set of Shootout at Medicine Bend, 1957, a black-and-white western that paired the seasoned veteran with the rising newcomer. For Garner, it was one of his first big roles, and sharing the screen with Randolph Scott was both intimidating and inspiring. "I was just trying not to screw up," Garner later said in an interview. Randy was the kind of man who didn't have to say much. He just was. From the start, the two men couldn't have been more different. Scott arrived early, disciplined and reserved, treating every scene like a precision drill. Garner, by contrast, brought a relaxed, almost playful energy that often disarmed the crew. Yet rather than clash, the contrast between them created a quiet balance, a mutual awareness that each man brought something unique to the screen. During breaks, Scott often kept to himself, preferring the company of a few close crew members. Garner would joke with the extras, trade stories, and lighten the mood on set. Randy was from another time, Garner once said. He carried that old studio-era professionalism. Stand tall, hit your mark, say your line. I respected that, but it wasn't my way. Despite their differing styles, Garner never forgot Scott's quiet authority. He didn't have to prove anything, Garner recalled. You could feel it in how he walked, how he looked at you. He was a man who had seen it all. Rumors have long circulated that Scott could be aloof or distant, especially with younger actors. But Garner didn't see it as arrogance. He saw it as self-assurance. He'd been making westerns since before I was out of high school, Garner laughed. If he wanted to keep to himself, he'd earned the right. Still, there was a tension on set, not hostile but charged. Garner's humor sometimes broke through Scott's stoicism, and when it did, everyone noticed. I cracked a joke once during a break, Garner said, and for just a second I saw him smile. Just a little one, but it was there. And that was enough for me. Their scenes together captured that dynamic perfectly, Scott's calm steadiness against Garner's youthful spontaneity. The camera loved their contrast, even if the movie itself faded into obscurity. Garner later joked that Shootout at Medicine Bend Wasn't much of a movie, but it was one hell of an education. Years later, Garner would look back on that time not with criticism, but with appreciation. Randolph Scott was old Hollywood, the kind of actor you learned from by watching, not talking, he said. He didn't tell you how to do it. He showed you. It was a meeting of two generations, the last of the old cowboys and the first of the new. And though their collaboration was brief, the impression it left on James Garner would echo throughout his career. As one era of Western heroes was fading and another was beginning, the torch had quietly passed, not with grand gestures, but with mutual respect under the blazing California sun. After Shootout at Medicine Bend, James Garner's career began to take off. Television was transforming the entertainment world, and Garner, with his natural wit and easy charm, was perfectly suited for it. While many traditional Western actors struggled to adjust to the more conversational, fast-paced style of TV, Garner embraced it. In 1957, he landed the role that would define him, Brett Maverick, in the hit series Maverick. It was a turning point, not just for Garner, but for the Western itself. Gone were the days of the silent, stoic gunslinger. Brett Maverick was clever, flawed, and funny, a hero who would rather outthink his opponent than outshoot him. And in many ways, that new kind of cowboy had roots in what Garner had observed from Randolph Scott. Randy didn't talk much, Garner later said, but I learned a lot by watching him. He had a confidence about him, a kind of grace. Even when he wasn't doing anything, you couldn't take your eyes off him. I figured, if you could mix that kind of stillness with a little humor, you'd have something special. That something special became Garner's trademark. While Scott represented the dying breed of the classic cowboy, tall, quiet, and idealized, Garner brought humanity into the Western landscape. His characters got tired, made mistakes, even poked fun at themselves. It was the bridge between old Hollywood and the modern anti-hero. Still, Garner never forgot where he came from, nor the lessons he learned from those early film sets. Working with Randy taught me respect, not just for the job, but for the people around you, he said. He wasn't the kind of guy to waste time or tolerate nonsense. You showed up, did your work, and did it well. That stuck with me. Behind the scenes, though, the difference between their worlds was becoming more apparent. By the time Maverick was dominating TV screens, Randolph Scott had retired from acting, closing out his career with the acclaimed Ride the High Country, 1962. It was a poetic farewell, a story about aging cowboys facing the end of an era. Garner admired Scott's decision to walk away gracefully. He knew when to stop, he once said. That takes guts. Most actors hang on too long, chasing something that's already gone. Randy didn't. He left on his own terms, and that's rare. The contrast between them was striking. Scott, the disciplined veteran who ended his career with dignity. Garner, the everyman who continued to reinvent himself in film and television for decades. Yet, despite their different paths, Garner always spoke of Scott with respect, even affection. He was one of those guys who didn't need to explain himself, Garner said. Some folks thought he was cold, but he wasn't. He just didn't see the point in small talk. I kind of admired that. He was focused, professional, and believe me, in this business, that's saying something. In many ways, Randolph Scott embodied the foundation that James Garner built upon. Scott represented the integrity, stoicism, and quiet strength of Hollywood's golden age. Garner brought in the humor, realism, and humanity of the next generation. Together, even if only briefly, they symbolized the evolution of the American hero. Decades later, when asked to compare himself to the older Western stars, Garner smiled and said, I wasn't trying to be John Wayne or Randolph Scott. I was just trying to be me. But if you're going to learn from anyone, you could do a lot worse than those two. For Garner, that early encounter with Scott wasn't just a footnote in his career. It was the foundation for everything that came after. The lessons of discipline, humility, and quiet strength stayed with him for life. Randolph Scott may have been the last of the old cowboys, but through James Garner, his influence lived on, just in a lighter, more modern form. And though they stood for different eras, the respect between them was timeless, carved into Hollywood history like footprints in the desert dust. By the 1980s, James Garner had become one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. His charm was effortless, his screen presence magnetic, and his characters, from Maverick to the Rockford Files, embodied a new kind of heroism, smart, flawed, funny, and deeply human. But as Garner reflected on his long career, he often looked back on the men who had shaped him, and one name always resurfaced: Randolph Scott. In interviews and memoirs, Garner never sensationalized his connection with Scott. He didn't call him a mentor, nor did he pretend they shared a deep friendship. But he did acknowledge that Scott represented something important, something that Hollywood was losing. "Randy was old school," Garner said once. "He was from a time when a handshake meant everything, when actors carried themselves with a kind of quiet pride. You didn't see that much anymore." Randolph Scott, by the time Garner spoke those words, had been gone for years. He had lived out his retirement far from the Hollywood spotlight, spending his later years in peace with his wife in Beverly Hills. While others chased fame, Scott had found contentment in stepping away, his legacy already secure. To Garner, that choice said more about Scott's character than any movie role ever could. "He didn't need attention," Garner said. "He'd done his part." He left with dignity. That's a lesson I wish more people would learn. In truth, the two men represented opposite sides of the same coin. Scott was the classic Western hero, stoic, reserved, and guided by duty. Garner was the modern cowboy, relatable, witty, and skeptical of authority. Yet both men shared an unshakable sense of integrity. They didn't compromise who they were, even when Hollywood tried to shape them into something else. During his later years, Garner often reflected on how the industry had changed. The old-timers like Scott didn't have social media, managers, or image consultants, he once said. They just showed up, did the work, and went home. That was it. There was honesty in that simplicity. He admired Scott's professionalism and the way he carried himself, never demanding special treatment, never letting fame define him. He was one of the few who understood that being a star doesn't make you better than anyone, Garner noted. He treated people the same, whether they were producers or stagehands. Despite their differences in style, both men had something rare in common. They believed in the truth of their characters. Scott brought authenticity to the Western myth. Garner humanized it. Together, their legacies painted the full picture of the American cowboy. Strength with vulnerability, stoicism with wit, grit with grace. One of Garner's favorite memories, as he once shared in an interview, came from watching Scott between takes. He'd just sit there, quiet as ever, maybe with a coffee in his hand, watching the crew. He didn't talk much, but you could tell he respected everyone working around him. That stuck with me. You learn who people are by how they treat others when the cameras aren't rolling. As Garner aged, he found himself embodying many of the same traits he'd admired in Scott. The calm, the steadiness, the no-nonsense attitude. "I guess we all turn into the men we once looked up to," he said with a grin in one of his final interviews. Randolph Scott's influence lived on not just in Garner, but in every actor who followed, from Clint Eastwood to Kevin Costner. The quiet confidence, the moral clarity, the strength without arrogance, these were all echoes of Scott's legacy, carried forward by those who admired him. Whether they'd met him or not, for James Garner, that influence was personal. "I didn't realize it at the time," he admitted, "but watching Randy work taught me how to carry myself, on and off the set. He made me understand that being a good actor isn't just about what's on camera. It's about who you are when it stops rolling." In the end, the truth Garner shared about Randolph Scott wasn't scandalous or shocking. It was simple and sincere. Scott wasn't mysterious or unkind. He was just a man from a different time, who lived and worked with quiet integrity. And for James Garner, that was the highest compliment anyone could earn. In the twilight of his life, James Garner remained one of Hollywood's most respected figures, admired not just for his long career, but for his honesty, humility, and refusal to play by the industry's shallow rules. When asked in interviews to look back, he spoke candidly about fame, about the changing face of Hollywood, and occasionally about the people who had shaped him. Among them, Randolph Scott still stood as a quiet but lasting presence. To Garner, Scott represented something that Hollywood had long since lost: dignity without ego. "He was from the days when you didn't need to talk yourself up," Garner once said. "Your work spoke for you." Randy didn't brag, didn't gossip, didn't play games. He showed up, did the job right, and went home. I always respected that. That sentiment reflected Garner's own philosophy. Like Scott, he had little patience for Hollywood politics. Both men had built careers on authenticity, not artifice. They didn't pretend to be heroes. They simply played them truthfully. Randolph Scott didn't act tough, Garner said. He was tough. And not in a loud way, in a quiet, unshakable way. By the time Garner reached his later years, he had outlived most of his contemporaries. Many of the men who had shaped Hollywood's golden age, Cooper, Wayne, Stewart, and Scott, were long gone. Yet their shadows lingered in the roles and ideals of those who followed. When asked once who among them had impressed him the most, Garner didn't hesitate. "Randy Scott," he said, because he never needed the spotlight to prove who he was. Scott's final film, Ride the High Country, 1962, had become something of a touchstone for Garner. He admired its quiet melancholy, the story of two aging gunfighters trying to hold onto their code of honor in a world that had moved on. In a way, Garner saw himself in that story. That movie said everything about the kind of men we used to play. Men with rules, with pride, even when nobody cared anymore, he said. Garner believed that Scott's career was a perfect example of how to live with integrity in an industry built on illusion. He didn't chase fame, Garner said. He let it come to him. And when it was time to walk away, he did. No farewell tour, no headlines. Just quiet grace. That's the kind of man I always wanted to be. The deeper truth, the one Garner finally revealed in his later interviews, wasn't about drama or rivalry. It was about respect, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted or written in headlines. Garner never saw Scott as cold or distant. He saw him as private, self-contained, a man who understood the difference between image and integrity. He wasn't unfriendly, Garner clarified. He was just from a time when you didn't wear your feelings on your sleeve. You got up, you did your work, and you let that speak for you. That honesty struck a chord with fans. In an era obsessed with scandal and gossip, Garner's words reminded people that some stories didn't need to be sensationalized to be meaningful. The truth was simple. Randolph Scott was exactly who he appeared to be: strong, professional, and decent. In the end, that was the real revelation. Not a hidden feud or secret story, but a rare kind of mutual respect between two men who defined what it meant to be genuine. Garner summed it up best in his memoir. "I liked Randolph Scott. He was a gentleman. And in this business, that's worth more than gold." As the lights of old Hollywood faded, their names endured. Two men from different generations, bound by a shared code of honesty and quiet strength. The cowboy they both portrayed, calm, resolute, and unshaken by fame, may have been a Hollywood creation, but in men like Scott and Garner, that spirit was real. And so, when James Garner finally told the truth about Randolph Scott, it wasn't a confession or an expose, it was a tribute. A salute from one legend to another. A simple acknowledgement that sometimes the strongest men are the ones who never need to say much at all.